Fort Bliss, Texas, September 1944. The desert wind carried dust, diesel, and something no American soldier expected to see that day. 23 women stepped off army trucks, not nurses, not refugees, prisoners. They wore torn, Wehrmacht uniforms. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gaunt and weathered. Beyond their years, they were the ghosts Germany pretended didn't exist. Comfort. Girls. And when they tasted their first American meal, they didn't smile. They shattered. But the tears were only the beginning of what Fort Bliss was about to uncover. Before we go further into this story, subscribe to WW2 Soldiers Archive and comment below where you're watching from around the world. This story needs to be remembered. Let's make sure it is. September 14, 1944. Captain Harold Whitman stood at the gates of Fort Bliss, clipboard in hand, watching the dust cloud grow larger on the horizon. He had processed hundreds of German POWs before Luftwaffe pilots, panzer crews, hardened infantrymen from the Atlantic Wall. But this convoy was different. The intelligence brief had been vague, almost deliberately so. Female detainees, non-combat personnel, handle with discretion. When the first truck rolled through the checkpoint, Whitman saw their faces through the canvas. Young, exhausted, terrified. Most weren't even 25. The guards didn't know where to look. Female PS were rare. These women were something else entirely. What the captain didn't know yet was that half of them weren't even German. The women stepped down from the trucks one by one. No defiance, no pride, just emptiness. One blonde woman, later identified as Liesel, kept her eyes on the ground. Her hands trembled as she gripped a torn Red Cross bag that wasn't hers. Behind her, a quiet brunette in a stained civilian coat stared at the American flag flying above the barracks. Her lips moved silently like she was trying to remember a prayer. Sergeant Bill Carter, a farm boy from Iowa, muttered to Whitman, "Sir, what the hell do we do with them?" Whitman didn't have an answer. The German army had denied their existence. No official records, no ranks, no names in any registry. They were shadows sent to Wehrmacht outposts near the French border, used, forgotten, and now America's responsibility. The Texas sun beat down on the procession. As the women were led toward the temporary barracks, their footsteps kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. Some limped, others walked as if in a trance. One woman near the back of the line kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to drag her back onto the trucks. The youngest among them couldn't have been more than 19. Her face still carried the softness of adolescence, but her eyes had aged decades. She clutched a small cloth bundle against her chest, protecting it like it contained the last piece of her former life. Captain Whitman had been told to expect complications. What he hadn't been told was what kind. As he watched the line of women disappear into the barracks, he felt an unease he couldn't quite name. These weren't hardened enemy combatants. They weren't ideological zealots who spat curses at their captors. They were something war had created and then tried to erase. The forgotten ones. The invisible casualties of a conflict that consumed everything in its path. But Captain Whitman was about to learn something that would turn everything he thought he knew upside down. The afternoon stretched long as the women were assigned bunks and given basic supplies, clean uniforms, blankets, soap, simple things that most of them hadn't seen in months. The camp had housed thousands of male prisoners, but the infrastructure for women was makeshift at best. Privacy screens were erected hastily. Female nurses from the base hospital were called in to conduct medical examinations. What they found shocked them. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, signs of prolonged stress and trauma. One woman had a partially healed bullet wound in her shoulder that had never been properly treated. Another showed evidence of frostbite on her toes from the previous winter. These were not women who had been cared for by their own side. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Sergeant Carter received orders to prepare the evening meal for the new arrivals. He gathered his kitchen crew and began the familiar routine. Peel potatoes, season the chicken, mix the cornbread batter. Standard American fare. Nothing fancy, nothing special. Just the kind of hot meal that soldiers and prisoners alike received every evening at Fort Bliss. Carter hummed as he worked, thinking about his own mother's cooking back in Iowa. The kitchen filled with warmth and the rich aroma of roasting meat. The sun dipped low over the Texas desert. Inside the mess hall, the long tables had been set with metal trays and utensils. The women were led in by two guards who looked uncomfortable with their assignment. The prisoners filed in silently, taking seats without instruction, as if they had learned long ago not to ask questions or make demands. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across their faces. Some kept their heads down, others stared straight ahead at nothing. Liesl sat near the middle of the group, her trembling hands now clasped tightly together in her lap. When Sergeant Carter and his crew began bringing out the food, the smell preceded them. Cornbread, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. The steam rose from the serving trays, carrying with it the scent of a home-cooked meal. For the 23 women seated in that hall, it might as well have been a banquet from another world. They had eaten moldy bread for weeks, cold beans, dirty water, sometimes nothing at all for days. When the trays were placed in front of them, nobody moved. They stared at the food as if it might disappear, as if reaching for it would break some terrible spell. Carter watched, confused by their hesitation. He had seen hungry prisoners before, seen men who devoured their meals with desperate urgency. But this was different. This was paralysis. He nodded to one of the women, encouraging her to eat. She didn't acknowledge him. Then Liesl, the blonde woman with the trembling hands, leaned forward slowly, her eyes fixed on the piece of roast chicken on her tray. Her breathing quickened. Her chest rose and fell with increasing rapidity. And then she broke. The sound that came from Liesl was not a whimper or a quiet sob. It was a deep guttural cry that seemed to tear itself from somewhere ancient inside her. Her whole body shook with the force of it. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands clutched the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling into an abyss. Within seconds, the sound spread like a contagion. Another woman began to cry, then another, then another. Within moments, the entire mess hall was filled with the sound of 23 women weeping like the world had ended. What happened next would haunt every man in that room, and the reason why was something no one could have predicted. Captain Whitman stood frozen in the doorway of the mess hall. He had seen men cry before, had seen soldiers break down after battle, their minds unable to process what they had witnessed or done. But this was different. This was collective grief manifesting in real time, a shared trauma expressing itself through tears that seemed endless. Sergeant Carter set down his serving tray, unsure whether to comfort them or leave. The guards exchanged glances. Some looked away, others watched with a confusion that bordered on fear. These weren't tears of relief or gratitude. They were tears of something darker. Grief, guilt, memory. One of the translators, a German American corporal named Otto Becker, stepped forward. He had immigrated from Berlin as a child and spoke the language fluently. He knelt beside Liesl and spoke softly in German, asking what was wrong, why she was crying. Liesl looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and began to speak. Her words came in broken fragments between sobs. Becker listened, his expression changing from concern to confusion to something approaching horror. When she finished, he stood slowly and walked to Captain Whitman. "Sir, you need to hear this." What she said would reveal the terrible truth about where they had been and what they had survived. Liesl spoke through Corporal Becker in broken sentences that painted a picture of hell disguised as normally. A farmhouse near Metz, France. August 1944. The women had been stationed there for 3 months serving German officers who occupied the region. Their duties were never officially defined, existing in the gray zones of war that history rarely records. Cooking, cleaning, companionship, survival. One evening in mid-August, the farmhouse cook, an older German woman who had been conscripted into service, prepared a special meal. Roast chicken with herbs, potatoes, fresh bread from a nearby village. For a brief moment, as the smell filled the farmhouse, it felt almost normal, almost like life before the war. The women had gathered in the kitchen that evening, drawn by the warmth and the illusion of domesticity. They talked quietly among themselves. Some shared memories of home. Others spoke of family members they hoped were still alive. The youngest girl, a French teenager who had been taken from her village, helped set the table. She smiled for the first time in weeks. The German officers were away on patrol, and for those few hours, the women could pretend they were somewhere else. Someone else. The chicken roasted slowly in the old farmhouse oven, its aroma mixing with the wood smoke and the late summer air drifting through open windows. But that night, the American forces advanced. The liberation of France was moving faster than German command had anticipated. Allied bombers appeared in the sky just after sunset. The warning came too late. The bombs fell with precision, targeting German positions throughout the region. The farmhouse, marked on reconnaissance maps as a Wehrmacht facility, was hit in the first wave. The explosion tore through the building like a hand crushing a paper box. The roof collapsed. The walls fell inward. Fire consumed what remained. 7 of the women died in the rubble, crushed, burned, gone in seconds. Liesl had been outside smoking a cigarette she had traded for 3 days earlier. She survived, but the smell of roast chicken mixed with smoke and death never left her. Now in a Texas mess hall thousands of miles away, that same smell brought it all back. Not mercy, a ghost. Captain Whitman stood in the doorway listening to Becker's translation. He thought about his own wife back in Kansas City. The chicken dinner she used to make on Sunday evenings. The way the smell would greet him when he came home from work. How something so simple, so universally human, could carry so much weight, could become a trigger for trauma instead of comfort. He cleared his throat and gave a quiet order. Let them eat in peace. No questions tonight. The guards nodded and stepped back. The kitchen crew retreated, but the crying continued softer now, tapering into exhausted silence. One by one, the women began to eat slowly at first. Then, with the hunger of people who had been starving for longer than just the past few weeks. Some cried while they ate, others stared blankly ahead, chewing mechanically. Liesl ate nothing. She sat with her hands in her lap, staring at the tray before her as if it contained evidence of crimes she couldn't forget. The brunette woman, the one who would later be identified as Ellen Brooks, watched Liesl from across the table. Their eyes met briefly. Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, understanding, or perhaps something more complicated than either. But peace was the one thing Fort Bliss wasn't about to get. 3 days later, on September 17, the camp's administrative office began the formal processing of the women names, nationalities, service records if they had any. Captain Whitman oversaw the operation personally, still unsettled by what had happened in the mess hall. Each woman was interviewed individually with Corporal Becker translating. The process was slow and often frustrating. Some women gave only minimal information. Others claimed not to remember their own backgrounds. The trauma of their experiences had fragmented memory, leaving gaps that couldn't easily be filled. That's when the irregularities started appearing. 2 of the women spoke Polish, not German. When questioned, they revealed they had been taken from villages near Kov in 1942 and transported west. 3 others spoke fluent French with regional accents from Normandy and Lyon. They had been absorbed into German units as those regions fell under occupation. The official narrative that these were German comfort girls began to crumble. They were a collection of the displaced, the captured, the forgotten from across occupied Europe. Women whose identities had been erased and rewritten by the machinery of war. And then there was the quiet brunette, the one who had stared at the American flag, the one who had watched Liesl with such intensity. Her paperwork, such as it existed, listed her as Anna Schmidt, German national, born in Munich. But when Corporal Becker interviewed her, beginning with standard questions in German, she answered in perfect Midwestern English, "My name is Ellen Brooks. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. And I need to speak with whoever is in charge here immediately." The room went silent. Becker stood so quickly his chair fell backward. He left the room and returned moments later with Captain Whitman. The woman repeated her statement. Ellen Brooks, age 28, Red Cross volunteer, last seen in Vichy, France, summer of 1941. Presumed dead for 3 years. But she wasn't dead. She had been taken by German forces. Her Red Cross credentials ignored. Or perhaps the very reason she was taken. Forced to live among them. Forced to survive as one of them. Forced to forget who she had been. Ellen's reappearance turned Fort Bliss upside down. Within hours, communications were sent to Washington. The War Department responded with unprecedented speed. Reporters who had been sniffing around the camp for stories about female PS were suddenly denied access. Files were sealed. Orders came directly from high-level command. Keep this quiet. Ellen Brooks was placed in isolated quarters. Additional guards were assigned. Medical personnel conducted extensive examinations. Intelligence officers arrived from El Paso and began debriefing sessions that lasted hours. The other women were separated and questioned again, this time about their knowledge of Ellen and any other Americans or Allied personnel who might have been among them. But Ellen had something to say, something that couldn't be contained by orders or classification, something that would unravel everything. And it involved Liesl. Ellen Brooks sat across from Captain Whitman in a bare interrogation room on September 20th. A cup of coffee sat untouched between them. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single overhead bulb that cast harsh shadows. Whitman had a dozen questions prepared, carefully worded to extract maximum information while maintaining protocol. But before he could ask the first one, Ellen spoke. "You think we were just comfort girls, don't you?" Her voice was steady, but carried an edge of something bitter. Whitman hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "That's what the report said. That's what we were told to expect." Ellen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No humor. Just a dark acknowledgement of absurdity. "Some of us were," she said, "used that way, treated that way, but not all and not Liesel." The name hung in the air between them like smoke. Whitman leaned forward, his interest sharpening. "What about her? What do you know about Liesel?" Ellen's hands tightened around the edge of the table. Her knuckles went white. She wasn't just assigned to that farmhouse, Captain. She was part of a medical unit, a secret one. They experimented on PS. French resistance fighters, anyone they could get their hands on, anyone who wouldn't be missed or whose disappearance could be explained away. Whitman felt his stomach turn. The rumors of Nazi medical experiments were known but poorly documented at this stage of the war. The full horror of what had been done in concentration camps and secret facilities would not be revealed until the following year. But here in this small room in Texas, one of the victims was sitting before him. "And you?" he asked quietly. Ellen looked him directly in the eye. "I was one of them. One of the experiments. They kept me alive because I had medical training. Because I could assist. Because I knew things they wanted to know about American field medicine and Red Cross protocols, but mostly because the doctor in charge enjoyed having an American to practice on." What Ellen revealed next would explain the tears, the silence, and why Liesel couldn't look anyone in the eye. The medical unit near Metz operated in the basement of a converted manor house about 2 kilometers from where the women were eventually stationed. Ellen had been held there for almost 2 years from late 1941 until mid-1944. The experiments were not the industrialized horror of places like Auschwitz or Dachau. They were smaller, more focused, designed to test specific theories about pain tolerance, disease resistance, and psychological breaking points. Ellen described injections that caused fever and delirium, forced exposure to cold, deprivation of sleep, food, water, procedures performed without anesthesia to observe the body's responses. Liesel had been a nurse in that facility, not the doctor, not the one giving orders, but present nonetheless. Ellen was careful to make this distinction. Even as she described what had happened, Liesel didn't kill anyone directly. She didn't design the experiments or decide who would be subjected to them, but she assisted. She recorded data. She administered drugs. She cleaned instruments. She watched and she knew. Ellen paused, her voice dropping lower, and she knew it was wrong. I could see it in her face sometimes. The way she would look away. The way her hands would shake when she had to prepare the next injection. But she did it anyway because refusing meant becoming one of the subjects. And survival overrides morality when you're trapped. When the American forces began their advance in August 1944, orders came to evacuate and destroy evidence. The medical facility was dismantled rapidly. Records were burned. Equipment was packed and shipped east. Some of the test subjects were transferred. Others were executed to eliminate witnesses. Ellen was moved to the farmhouse with a group of other women. Her identity as a former Red Cross worker buried under the false name Anna Schmidt. Liesel was among the women sent to the same location. Whether this was coincidence or deliberate, Ellen never knew. But for 2 weeks, they lived under the same roof. Neither spoke about their shared past. Neither acknowledged what had happened in that basement. They existed in careful silence, 2 people bound by trauma and guilt, waiting for whatever would come next. And then came the bombing. The farmhouse was hit. 7 women died. The survivors were captured by American forces days later and eventually transported to Fort Bliss. Ellen and Liesel had not spoken to each other during the journey, had not acknowledged each other beyond what was necessary. But when they sat down in that mess hall and the smell of roast chicken filled the air, everything came back. For Ellen, it was the memory of the farmhouse and the brief moment of peace before the bombs fell. But for Liesel, it was something more. It was the realization that her past had followed her. That sitting across from her was someone who knew exactly what she had done. That mercy and judgment had arrived together on a metal tray in Texas. That meal wasn't just a ghost of grief. It was a ghost of guilt. Whitman sat back in his chair, processing what he had heard. Does she know you remember? Ellen nodded slowly. She knows. I saw it in her eyes the moment the food was served. She recognized me then. Maybe she suspected before, but in that moment, she knew for certain, and she understood that I knew who she was and what she had been part of. The tears weren't just about lost friends or trauma. They were about being seen, about having your sins exposed in the one place you thought you might finally be safe. Captain Whitman stood up. He had to confront Lissel. Had to hear her side of this impossible story. Had to determine what should be done with both women. Were they victims, perpetrators? Could someone be both simultaneously? The moral mathematics of war didn't offer easy equations. But when he went to find Liesel the next morning, she was gone. September 21, 1944. Dawn. Liesel's bunk was empty. Her few belongings, a change of clothes, and a small Bible she had carried from France, were gone. The blanket was folded neatly at the foot of the bed, as if she had tidied up before leaving. The perimeter fence showed no signs of breach. The wire was intact, the posts undisturbed. The guard tower reported no movement. During the night, the sentries had seen nothing unusual. Yet somehow Liesel had vanished from a secured prisoner of war camp without leaving a trace. Some of the other women claimed they heard her crying in the night, soft sobs that drifted through the barracks like an echo. Others said she whispered a name over and over. Metz. 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 One woman reported seeing Liesel standing by the window around midnight, looking out at the dark expanse of desert, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. But no one reported seeing her leave. No one heard a door open or footsteps on the wooden floor. She was simply there, and then she wasn't. A full search was launched at first light. Jeeps fanned out across the desert in expanding circles. Bloodhounds were brought from El Paso, given Liesel's scent from her bedding. They tracked southeast for about a mile before losing the trail completely, as if she had simply evaporated. Soldiers on foot searched ravines and rock formations. Aircraft flew patterns overhead, observers scanning the ground for any sign of movement or disturbance, but the Texas plains were vast and unforgiving, a landscape that swallowed secrets easily and gave nothing back. 3 days later, on September 24, the search was officially called off. Captain Whitman filed his report. Liesel's file was marked with the notation missing, presumed dead. The official explanation was that she had likely died of exposure in the desert. Her body consumed by scavengers or buried by shifting sand. It was a tidy conclusion to an untidy situation. No body meant no questions about how she had escaped. No investigation into whether guards had been complicit or simply negligent. No uncomfortable inquiries from Washington about security protocols. The matter was closed, but Sergeant Bill Carter swore he saw something that last night. He had been on kitchen duty late preparing supplies for the next day's meals. Around 2 in the morning, he stepped outside for air and to smoke a cigarette. In the distance, beyond the fence line, he saw a figure walking toward the horizon. Not running, not stumbling, just walking with steady, deliberate steps. The figure was small, female, wearing what looked like a light-colored dress or nightgown that caught the moonlight. Carter watched for several minutes, debating whether to sound an alarm, but something stopped him. The figure walked like someone who had already made peace with where they were going, like someone who had decided their destination long before their feet began to move. Liesel was never found, but her story didn't end there. The remaining 22 women were eventually processed and transferred to other facilities over the following months. Some were repatriated to their home countries after the war ended. Others, particularly those from Eastern Europe, chose to remain in America rather than return to regions now under Soviet control. Their individual stories scattered to the winds, each one carrying fragments of trauma that would never fully heal. The camp at Fort Bliss continued its operations, housing thousands of German and Italian PS through the remainder of the war and into the occupation period. But among the guards and staff who had been present that September, the story of the 23 women became something spoken about only in quiet moments. Ellen Brooks was reunited with her family in St. Louis in November of 1944. The reunion was covered by local newspapers, though the details of her captivity were censored by military authorities. She was described as a Red Cross worker who had been held by the Germans and subsequently liberated. No Mention was made of the experiments, the medical unit, or the farmhouse near Metz. Ellen returned to nursing after the war, but never spoke publicly about her experiences. She married in 1948, had 2 children, and lived a quiet life in suburban Missouri. But those who knew her well noted that she never cooked chicken, never could stand the smell of it roasting, always claimed it made her nauseated. In 1982, 38 years after the events at Fort Bliss, a researcher from the Veterans History Project contacted Ellen for an interview. She was 76 years old then, her children grown, her husband deceased. She agreed to speak on the condition that the interview would be sealed for 20 years after her death. In that interview declassified in 2018, she said something haunting about Lissel. She wasn't a monster. She was just trapped like all of us. War doesn't let you choose who you become. It makes you into something else, something you never imagined you could be, and then expects you to live with it afterward. Liesel couldn't. I understand why. Some sins are too heavy to carry, even when you didn't choose to commit them. Fort Bliss continued operating long after the war ended, eventually becoming one of the largest military installations in the United States. The old P-camp sections were demolished in the 1960s and 70s, replaced by modern facilities. The barracks, where the women had stayed, were torn down in 1967. The mess hall, where they had broken down over a simple meal, was demolished that same year. New buildings rose on the same ground, and new generations of soldiers trained on the same Texas plains where Lissel had walked into oblivion. But the memory persisted, passed down through unofficial channels. A ghost story told in the barracks on cold nights when the desert wind howled. And there was one more thing. Guards stationed in the area where the old mess hall had stood even years after its demolition reported something strange. On certain nights, particularly in September, when the desert wind picked up and the temperature dropped, they smelled roast chicken. The aroma would drift across the parade ground, distinct and unmistakable, strong enough that multiple people would comment on it simultaneously. Strong enough that new recruits would ask where the kitchens were, assuming a meal was being prepared nearby. But there were no kitchens in that area anymore. No cooking facilities, no explanation for a smell that came and went with the wind, even though the ovens had been cold for years. Even though the building itself no longer existed, the comfort girls of World War II remain one of history's most uncomfortable footnotes, denied by their own governments, forgotten by the victors, erased from official narratives. The systems that created them operated in shadows, leaving minimal documentation. When records existed, they were often destroyed in the final days of the war. The women themselves, when they survived, rarely spoke about their experiences. Shame, trauma, and societal judgment kept them silent. Their stories were deemed inappropriate for the heroic narratives that nations preferred to tell about themselves. So they faded, became rumors, became ghosts. But they existed. Thousands of them used by armies across every theater of the war. German, Japanese, Soviet, even among Allied forces, though in different forms and under different names. Women whose bodies and lives became resources to be managed and exploited. Women who had no choice in their participation. Women who were forced to carry the weight of choices made by others, by systems, by the grinding machinery of total war. Liesel, Ellen, and the others at Fort Bliss represent a truth we don't often talk about. War doesn't just destroy soldiers. It destroys everyone. It touches civilians, children, the innocent, and the complicit alike. It creates categories of victimhood so complicated that simple moral judgments become impossible. Their tears weren't just about a meal. They were about survival, guilt, memory. About being forced to carry the weight of choices they never wanted to make, about having your humanity reduced to utility, about being erased from history even as you lived through it. History remembers the generals and the battles. It remembers the strategic decisions and the turning points. It builds monuments to heroes and museums to honor sacrifice. But it's the forgotten stories, the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that resist simple narratives that remind us of war's real cost. Not just in lives lost, but in lives broken, in souls shattered, in the impossible moral terrain that ordinary people were forced to navigate. Liesel was never found. No body was ever recovered. No confirmation of death was ever established beyond the bureaucratic necessity of closing her file. Some believe she died in that desert, her body consumed by the elements and the animals that prowl the Texas plains. Others believe she survived somehow, walked to a town or a highway, assumed another identity, and disappeared into the vast anonymity of post-war America. Perhaps she's buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. Perhaps she lived for decades under a different name, carrying her secrets to a grave that bears someone else's inscription. The desert keeps its mysteries. Ellen Brooks lived until 1998, dying of natural causes at the age of 82. She outlived most of the people who had known about Fort Bliss and what had happened there. She outlived the reporters who had been turned away from the camp. She outlived Captain Whitman and Sergeant Carter and Corporal Becker. She carried the memory of Metz in silence, speaking about it only once in that sealed interview. When asked if she had forgiven Liesel, she said something that reveals the complexity of what they had experienced. Forgiveness isn't the right word. Understanding, maybe. She was 23 years old in that basement. Just a girl who wanted to be a nurse and ended up in hell. We both did. I hate what happened. I hate what was done to me. But I can't hate her. She was as much a prisoner as I was, just in a different cage. The mess hall at Fort Bliss was torn down in 1967 as part of a modernization program. The old wooden structure was dismantled over a period of 3 days. Workers reported nothing unusual during the demolition. The materials were hauled away. The foundation was removed. The ground was leveled and paved over. A parking lot now stands where the building once stood. Thousands of vehicles parked there every week. People walk across that asphalt on their way to offices and training facilities. None of them know what happened there. None of them know that in September of 1944, 23 women wept over a meal that reminded them of ghosts they couldn't escape. But the story remains. Not in official histories or textbooks, not in the grand narratives of World War II that focus on D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and the March to Berlin. It remains in the spaces between, in declassified interviews, in sealed files that eventually become unsealed. In the memories passed down through families who knew parts of the story, but never the whole thing. In the persistent reports of a smell that shouldn't exist. A reminder that even in war's darkest corners, there were people. People with names, with fears, with ghosts they couldn't escape. With choices they never wanted to make and consequences they couldn't avoid. This is their story and it deserves to be told. Not to sensationalize or exploit, not to provide easy answers or comfortable conclusions, but to remember, to acknowledge, to bear witness to the complicated, uncomfortable reality of what war does to human beings. The smell of roast chicken